Volume Editor's Preface. This is formally the last volume in the Science and Civilization in China series by Joseph Needham, although volumes that precede it in numerical sequence are still in press or in preparation at the time of writing. When he first thought seriously about the Science and Civilization in China project in the intervals of his work in wartime China, Needham originally aimed to write a single book. By 1948, this plan had expanded to 7 volumes, but later he realized that it would probably require some 30 volumes to cover all the topics envisaged, not so much because of the number of topics, but because of the wealth of information his wide-ranging researches revealed. He aimed to write 18 of these himself, and to delegate 12 to specialists. But of these 18 volumes, there were 6 which he was not able to finish, or in some instances even to start. These were 3 of the 4 volumes initially planned on the Institutes of Medicine, and 2 on the social background of China in relation to science, the second of which would have ended with his general conclusions. The volumes which he actually wrote were Volume 1, Introductory Orientations, Volume 2, History of Scientific Thought, Volume 3, Mathematics and the Sciences of the Heavens and the Earth, Volume 4, Part 1, Physics, Volume 4, Part 2, Mechanical Engineering, which concluded with some 30 pages concerning Chinese inventions and discoveries relevant to aeronautics, Volume 4, Part 3, Civil Engineering and Nautics, Volume 5, Part 2, the first of 4 volumes on alchemy and the beginning of chemistry, this one being mainly concerned with the Magistries of Gold and Immortality. Part 3 of Volume 5 traced the development of synthetic insulin from cinnabar elixirs. Part 4 was concerned with the development of chemical apparatus and theories from their alchemical beginnings. And the last of the 4, Part 5 of Volume 5, was concerned with physiological alchemy and its contribution to modern psychology. This made 10 volumes. 2 more were Volume 5, Part 7 on the Gunpowder Epic, which was, however, in large measure the work of Ho Ping-yu, one of his most productive collaborators, and Volume 6, Part 1, the first of 2 volumes on botany. Volume 6, Part 6 represents what he completed on the subject of medicine. The average length of time spent in bringing a volume to publication was 3.3 years. Though this takes no account of the time spent on preliminary work and research before the final writing began. Very often, portions of the work were first published as scientific papers. Needham was, for example, working on the text of Volume 4, Part 1 in 1948, 14 years before it was published, and 6 years before even Volume 1 was published by Cambridge University Press. The 18 volumes which Needham intended to write himself were therefore likely to require approximately 60 years of work, plus the immense labour of preliminary research. The extent of this labour can be judged by the fact that when I asked him in the mid-1970s how he was getting on with the volume on botany, he replied, "At present, it's a green blur." He once wrote to a friend, Mr. Hu Tao-cheng, "It has been my experience all along that whenever I embark on a new chapter, we find that the subject is full of misunderstandings, mistranslation, erroneous ideas, and what are just plain errors. Gradually the true picture emerges as one works on." By 1983, however, when we saw his botany text being made ready for printing, it was no longer a green blur. On the contrary, Needham had sorted out the different Chinese systems of plant classification, comparing them with European systems to such good effect that this volume on botany made an important contribution to the writing of the present volume in the article Literary Chinese as a Language for Science. As Needham was 47 when he started writing the final text for Science and Civilization in China Volume 1, he could not have hoped to complete the 18 volumes he eventually envisaged before he had reached the age of 107. What he was not to know until much later was that the scientific treasures to be discovered in the mountain of Chinese literature were so great that they could not be brought completely to light in 7 volumes, or even in 18, but that eventually 29 volumes would be needed to contain them, despite the fact that some intended subjects were abandoned as impracticable. Needham was granted 94 years for his amazingly productive life. He continued working on his general conclusions till only 2 days before he died, but Science and Civilization in China was only part of his total output. He had 250 works to his credit, in addition to the volumes of Science and Civilization in China. Gregory Blue lists some 385 publications in his very useful Joseph Needham, A Publication History, Chinese Science 14, 1997, pages 90 to 132. These cover new books of his own, translations, contributions with other authors, books he had edited, and well over 150 scientific papers. We may now consider his dilemma. As Needham delved ever deeper into his subject, more and more sources for the precious ore which he was seeking kept opening up. Was he to leave it, as an archaeologist finding King Priam's golden treasure might bury it again for fear that he would not have time to assess it properly, or was he to bring it into the light of day and trust that future archaeologists would finish his work where he had left off? All Needham's instincts were for bringing what was hidden into the light of day and trusting posterity to make a true evaluation of it. Therefore, each volume in turn became more bulky than the last. Volume 1 was a reasonably slender book of 248 pages of text, but Volume 2 had more than doubled, with 503 pages, and Volume 3, with its 683 pages and very extensive supplementary pages, had become so heavy that, as Needham said, it was too big to read comfortably in one's bath. So it was decided that in future each volume should be a reasonable size. This good resolution was followed in Volume 4, Part 1, which had only 334 pages of text, but by Volume 4, Part 2, this good intention was abandoned, for it now had 602 pages, and Volume 4, Part 3, broke all records with 699 pages of text. Then it came to Volume 5, whose subject was chemistry and its applications. The introduction to chemistry through alchemy in 4 volumes made it quite certain that Needham would not be able to finish the work himself, for the alchemical volumes would require 13 years for their publication, by which time Needham would be 84. Gunpowder, botany, 4 medical volumes, and 2 concluding volumes on the social background still barred the way to a quiet retirement. Delegation became essential. He had first delegated to me the subsection in Volume 4, Part 1 on acoustics in 1949 with the words, "Acoustics is my blind spot. I'd like you to fill it with perhaps 20 pages. In the end it came to just over 100, and that was before the subject had been opened up by archaeologists with the wonderful discovery of complete sets of bells establishing the frequencies of the notes of the traditional scale. This expansion persisted throughout. Once something previously unknown in the West was discovered, Needham was reluctant to let it go again. Consequently, several collaborators who were asked to contribute portions of a volume ended up by writing complete volumes themselves. Eventually 16 volumes would be completed by 15 collaborators. Fresh problems began to arise. That whole books were being produced by authors who had been invited to contribute just one section of a book was not in itself necessarily contrary to Needham's wishes, but a different situation arose when the work submitted by that author did not fit into the general plan, or where it contained ideas which Needham found unacceptable. Needham had originally listed a number of factors that he felt formed part of the social background, enabling or disabling the rise of science. These included the geography of China, physical and economic circumstances, language, logic, concepts of time, the role of religion, the consequences of class attitudes, competition, nature and man, and many others. He hoped to retain overall control of the final volumes in which these factors were considered, but to be helped in the task by specialists who would contribute sections that would fit into the plan. He hoped to retain overall control of the final volumes in which these factors were considered, but to be helped in the task by specialists who would contribute sections that would fit into the general plan. This was not possible. By the time he was 80 and ready to give his mind to the writing of the last volume, while also writing the Institutes of Medicine, a wide generation gap had opened up between himself and the best of the young sinologists. In the year 1980, I was invited to come from Hamburg to help Needham and his collaborators finish the remaining volumes. Needham at that time still intended to be in strict control of Volume 7. There were difficulties, however. It was found impossible, for example, to persuade a modern geographer to write about his subject in such a way that the geography of China could be seen to be influencing the way scientific thinking developed. A volume was produced, but while excellent in itself, it was a historical geography of China, not part of the Science and Civilization in China series as Needham saw it. A more difficult situation arose, however, when Professor Dirk Bodder, one of the group of 6 scholars who, Needham hoped, would help him in the writing of Volume 7, unexpectedly presented him with a substantial manuscript, which followed very completely and precisely the outline which Needham had drawn up for Section 49 of Volume 7, Intellectual and Social Factors. In it, Bodder put forward many views which Needham found quite unacceptable. Yet he hated saying no, and as he explained later, when the leading American sinologist offers you as a gift a work on which he has spent more than a year, you can hardly refuse to accept it. Needham felt that Bodder's work would be far better published as an independent contribution to scholarship, but sought a compromise, and said he would be pleased to have it published as part of Volume 7, provided that certain changes could be made in the writing. There was the rub. I was called in to sort out the differences of view between the 2 giants of the sinological world. This situation in which I found myself is neatly summed up in the Burmese proverb, where elephants fight, the grass is trampled. The 2 main differences in points of view were 1. The role of the classical language of China in relation to science, and 2. Whether the Chinese could be said to have any real science at all. These were areas in which compromise were not possible. When it became obvious that compromise would not be possible, Needham had a new idea. H.G. Wells' Outline of History, which had been written in 1920, was met with a great deal of criticism. In 1931, Wells revised it, but following an original method. When he came to a passage with which a critic disagreed, Wells included the criticism in his text as a quotation, and then added his own riposte. Needham felt that this method would admirably suit Dirk Bodder's text. Where he disagreed with Bodder, he would insert the reasons for his disagreement, and if so desired would include Bodder's further argument. A beginning was made on these lines, and it would certainly have made an unusual and interesting book. But the crisis came when Bodder asked Needham to withdraw a passage of close argument, as it would upset the friends he had been quoting. Needham refused, and Bodder then withdrew his entire contribution. In this way the Gordian knot was cut, and the work of parcelling up portions of Volume 7 to specialized writers began. At first it looked as if it would be possible to do this following Needham's original plan. The role of logic was an important part of it, and the great Polish logician Janusz Civilisation had not only agreed to contribute a section, but had already submitted the first 42 pages of his text. During the year 1983, it became clear that Professor Chmielewski would not be able to complete his undertaking due to the pressures he was under in Warsaw. It was suggested that he might have an assistant to work with him. Perhaps he would suggest and recommend a suitable younger logician. He recommended Dr. Christoph Habsmeyer, who visited Chmielewski, discussed the work, and agreed to take entire responsibility for it. He started work in September 1983. His contribution, like so many others to Science and Civilization in China, rapidly increased from a section of a volume to a complete book that in 1998 became Volume 7 Part 1. An article on language and science in traditional China had been begun as soon as disagreement on this topic with Dirk Bodder had become clear. It began as a riposte in the H.G. Wells tradition, was first conceived as forming part of a volume together with the work on logic, then became separated, and was to form a volume on its own. But after Needham's death it became important to get the whole work published as soon as possible. The text on language has therefore been included in the present volume in a shorter form than originally envisaged. The redesigning of Volume 7 had by the mid-1990s resulted in the following plan, which represents the concept of the volume at its greatest length. Part 1. The nature of Chinese society in comparative perspective. This would fall into 6 sections by different authors. Part 2. Language and the foundations of scientific civilization in ancient China. This eventually resolved itself into Language and Logic in Traditional China, written by Christoph Habsmeyer. Part 3. Language and Science in Traditional China, to contain a reconsideration of some characteristics of Chinese science, by Christopher Cullen, and Literary Chinese as a Language for Science, by Kenneth Robertson, working closely with Needham. Part 4. The Worldview of the Literati, to cover concepts of time, history, religion, education, and political organization. One by one, items in this ambitious scheme of things had to be abandoned, either because Needham found the work that was submitted was unacceptable, or because the author was unable to complete it, or decided to withdraw it. In some cases, work that had been completed and accepted had to be abandoned when the failure of other contributions withdrew vital elements from the structure. One decisive factor was that the history and sociology of science were in a state of turmoil from which they have not yet emerged, and if a work was not published soon after it was written, it was likely to be out of date. The old secure concept of world science, which had been part of Needham's background, had vanished. It was about this time that H.R.H. the Duke of Edinburgh, Chancellor of the University of Cambridge, visited the Needham Research Institute and interested himself in the progress of the project. "And how long will it take to finish it?" he inquired. On being given a rather conservative answer, "At least 10 years," he exclaimed. "Good God, man, Joseph will be dead before you've finished." A very true appreciation of the situation. If it had been possible for Needham effectively to write Volume 7 himself, using others to reinforce or supplement his own writing as he had done earlier in his life, Volume 7 might have been presented with the consistency of a scientist writing in the mid-20th century. But by the time he was 80 it was too late. Much had to be abandoned. Western views on China itself were changing, as Needham stresses on page 203 of the present volume, and these views have continued to change not only in the West but in China itself. There is therefore no possibility of presenting any definitive judgment on the role of China in world history, but only the views of a great scientist and polymath in the mid-20th century. The staff of the Needham Research Institute now found themselves in the position of the young man in Pope's essay on criticism, for whom hills peep o'er hills and Alps on Alps arise. The policy agreed on was not to attempt some of the major hills, on which Needham had written only briefly, and which would require much work from him if they were to be updated and brought to the level of his published work. Time, religion, and education fell into this category, but some of his existing writings could be brought together into Volume 7 Part 2, preserving as much as possible of what he had originally intended Volume 7 to be, and some could be updated if he had the help of an academically trained secretary. For it must be remembered that in his closing years, though his mind remained lucid and his memory astonishing, Needham had great difficulty even in moving from one chair to another, and even more difficulty in speaking and in making himself understood, due to the effect of the medicines he took to control Parkinsonism. But a secretary, working closely with him day by day, could often understand what he had said when others were baffled. When Needham died in March 1995, none of the material that he had intended for Volume 7 was in a condition ready for the press. In some cases there were in existence a number of inconsistent drafts, without a clear indication of which was to be the final text, and in other cases a section of text requiring the searching out of a great mass of references that were no doubt in Needham's capacious memory, but which had only been entered into his typescript in an abbreviated and sometimes cryptic form. As series editor and volume editor respectively, Christopher Cullen and I sat down together to decide what was to be done. Of decisive importance for us in deciding what should be included in Volume 7 was a document which Needham had composed in 1981 and revised in 1987 in the form of a testament in which he had set out his wishes as regards those of his writings which should be included in the event that he died without being able to see Volume 7 through the press. It is substantially this material that now forms Volume 7 Part 2. To this has been added the interesting chronological list of Chinese discoveries and inventions that Needham extracted from earlier volumes of Science and Civilization in China and elsewhere during his work for this volume in the last years of his life. Needham himself acknowledged the provisional nature of any such list, and no doubt some items in it are open to discussion. But many readers will find this compilation stimulating and perhaps useful in beginning investigation of other volumes of Science and Civilization in China. I should like to point out that in editing Needham's text, we have not made any attempt to eliminate occasional evidence that this material was not written yesterday. China has changed rapidly over the last decade, but Needham's views expressed in these writings largely relate to a China before these changes occurred. Likewise, respect for the integrity of the author's text has made us reluctant to make cuts when some parts of Needham's argument are common to various sections of this book. As editor of this volume, I was fortunate in having been frequently engaged in close discussion with Needham in the closing years of his life on all the topics with which Volume 7 deals, so that it was possible, though not always easy, to decide which of the variant versions of his text was the one he intended as his last word. It was also easier than it might have been, though not very easy, to locate the material needed for some of the lacunae in his references. The resulting task has been time-consuming, but I hope the reader will consider it worthwhile. I am confident that apart from the section of this volume in which I and others are specifically named as co-authors, what the reader has here is emphatically and authentically Joseph Needham, speaking here in the closing stages of one of the greatest scholarly projects ever undertaken. Kenneth Robinson.